In researching and analyzing the Torah recently, I've come to different understanding of how it's really structured. So usually the traditional view is that Moses wrote every single word of the first 5 books except the last chapter. Like that could have been Joshua or something. But the truth is, Moses really didn't have to write all of it, nor did he have the time for that. He was a judge, he was a priest, he was a king where he was living. So it's more likely that other people wrote parts of the Torah which he did not. He might have taught them a lot of the content in it. It's also likely they could have developed a lot of it over time. Like the book of Leviticus, when it prohibits the eating of pork, it's different from the other categories of animals because it has the cloven hoof and it does chew the cud, which is a requirement for the cattle you're eating, for the land animals you're eating. But even though pork fulfills those requirements, it's not allowed. It's prohibited. And Religion for Breakfast, a great YouTube channel, has a video about how that came to be. So I'd say look them up, Religion for Breakfast, pork, and you'll see the argument of why it was a later entering into Leviticus. There's also the last chapter, which talks about finance for the temple. That's chapter 27, probably written past the time of Samuel, according to Michael Heiser. So all this to say, how we read the first 5 books is completely different from how the ancient Israelites before the Babylonian exile read them. So this is what I would suggest. To really grasp the full experience, I'd say start, instead of how it's usually written out, do Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Genesis, then Leviticus. Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Genesis, Leviticus. Now, part of the reason I would do this is I'd say this is the way you would grasp the full context. Because, like Exodus and Deuteronomy, pretty much cover the main conception of Israel before the conquest of the land. Exodus and Deuteronomy covers all of that, with exception to the time of Abraham and on. They see themselves as, like, they see the myth of Abraham as very important to their beliefs. But it's such a small part of Genesis that they're probably more focused on the Passover and the escape from Egypt. So, if there is one question each book would ask, I would summarize it like this. Exodus, what is justice? Deuteronomy, what is temple building? Numbers, what is perseverance? Genesis, what is life without God? And Leviticus, what is holiness? Now, a channel called Inspiring Philosophy has a great series of videos on the Mosaic Law, which goes into detail about how it was a lot like proverbial wisdom, precedent for what justice is, and how it was designed for that society, which kind of needed some kind of slavery before the modern banking system. So check out Inspiring Philosophy's videos on the context for the laws in that day and how we can apply them to ourselves today as kind of ideas of justice. And I think that's a great argument because this is pretty uneducated people that are upholding God's system of justice, that are upholding God's vanquishment of idolatry. And because they're uneducated, doesn't mean they're not smart, but they don't have the language they need to actually discuss what justice is, what justice is not. They're only given a visible picture of what it is in the first 5 books. Exodus being at the heart of that. So it's not until the axial age of history that philosophy can be built up into a real language and used for something besides power. And it can be divorced from religion. But because they can only speak in religious terms, they need the system of justice as it's presented in those first 5 books. Now, there's also a great video by Aleph Beta. They're a Jewish YouTube channel. They have a video called How Do I Apply the Sacrifices to Myself Today? And they go into like 3 different systems of sacrifice, and I'd say they're pretty good. The only difference I would have is on the sin offering. It's really more of a decontamination offering because it was meant for something besides. It wasn't a cleansing of the soul. It was more of a cleansing of the body, in a way. So that's the only thing I would disagree on. And again, that's from Michael Heiser and his talk on Leviticus, which is on Spotify, by the way. He actually goes chapter by chapter into Leviticus and Exodus, and it's great. It's on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So, beginning with Exodus, what is justice? Now, why? I mean, first you need to know, why did God send Israel to Egypt in the first place? Well, it was so they don't become like their Canaanite neighbors, their idolatrous Canaanite neighbors. Egypt was supposed to draw the line between them and Israel, and they did successfully. So, especially with slavery. So, being in slavery, Israel was taught, okay, this is evil. Being kidnapped and forced to work, totally evil. And then they move on, and they're shown God's power. And as God shows them mercy, like, yeah, I saved you, and now you can choose whether or not to stick with me. They make a covenant, and in that covenant, they're given the 10 Commandments, and they're given specific laws for the question of what is justice. The first set of laws, those ones probably set by Moses. Then they break those laws, given to idolatry. And there's so many reasons why idolatry is so horrible. The main one being is it's just worship of the wrong God. It's worship of a false god, an idol. So for that reason, like maybe it says 3,000 in most translations, but it probably means 3 families because the Hebrew word for thousands is the same one as clans. So it's not 3,000 people, it's 3,000 clans of people that were killed. And you see that a lot, where God would need to send plague, or he would need to kill people as an object lesson of, this is wrong. This is, if people don't understand what evil is, or like you don't want people to think that mercy is deserved. So in order to establish mercy, you first have to establish justice. To establish justice, you have to bring punishment on somebody, just as an example. So he does that there, and he does that many times over in later texts. And notice when you read Exodus, there are allusions to people like Hammurabi and his code. No idea when exactly that was added. Maybe it was in the time of Moses, because the Amorites had a connection to Babylon. So they could have had that as a polemic against Amorite culture. Or it could have been later on, when they were close to being conquered by Babylon in Israelites' history. Maybe it was added then. Either way, it's to show we use the same language of legal code as our neighbors when we quote Hammurabi, but we don't. But we aren't our neighbors. We don't believe in like we believe we have a right to punish, which is lex talionis, principle of retribution, but we don't give the worst punishment every time. So when it says he shall surely be put to death for the crime of murder, or something like that, or for adultery, actually, that's only worst case scenario. That's it's saying what the highest level of punishment is allowed, because it is sin. It is destructive to people. Now, whether or not the legal systems used that level of punishment in that day, we don't have much record of that. If they ever used what was described in Exodus, because Exodus was not prescriptive. It was only descriptive. So the book of Exodus then ends on the people being charitable with their giving to the temple in order to build it. All the jewels they got from Egypt, or they got back from Egypt, really, because Egypt probably stole it from them as they came in. They use it to build this magnificent temple, and God empowers an artist to paint it really nicely. And the book ends with Moses not being able to enter the temple, because he became kind of unclean. The temple is a sacred space, and he probably would have died if he went inside, maybe. You just can't enter it, because maybe, with all the stress he's put on his shoulders, and with the people of Israel just acting out so much, they had found a way to become unclean. So it's not until maybe the design of Leviticus, or some kind of decontamination, that he's able to enter the temple, or the tabernacle, again in Numbers, early chapter of Numbers. But skipping over to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a treaty of sorts between a king and his vassals. It's called the suzerainty treaty. And the king in this context is, of course, God, and the vassals are the people of Israel. God is making a treaty with the new generation of Israelites. It starts with review of how they got from Egypt to the desert, to the 40 years, to the plains of Moab. And it goes into detail of how there's constant failure, but God still wants to uphold that covenant with you. And here are what to do by establishing a state when you conquer the land, and when you rule over it, and when you have when you have need of refugees. It goes into more detail of other laws. It's called repetition of the law, but it might be more than that, because it might be older than the other books. It's definitely what most scholars agree, what Josiah found when in 2 Kings, when he says Josiah found the book of the law. It might be Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 28 or 32, something like that. So the treaty has a great breakdown. It starts with a preamble, then it goes into praise to God, then it goes into the details of what to do in order to avoid sinning and to wipe out idolatry in the land of Canaan. And it also states what to do when you sin, because you will sin. You shouldn't sin, but you will, and here's what to do. Don't sin, and here's what to do when you sin. It ends with praise of the tribes and praise of God, and to establish that God appointed the angels to watch over the nations, and how most of the angels have failed in doing that and have become the gods of those nations. It's chapter 32. It says Israel, but the correct translation should be gods. Michael Heiser calls this the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I'd say check it out. There's more detail on this. So then it ends with Moses dying and his body being unable to be found, which is probably a good thing, because Israel actually thought he was God in a way, like he was a minor god or a sorcerer with power over the gods. So it was very important for his body to not be found so that it wouldn't be worshipped. And yes, of course, all the people cried for him, and it was very sad. And whoever is writing it said, there's never been a prophet like Moses ever since. So might be a much later addition to that book. Maybe Josiah wrote it, who knows. The book after that is Numbers. Now, the question I ask for Numbers, what is perseverance? I ask that because it's kind of like a slow burn of a book. Like, you just have to persevere just reading through it. Because, like, there's just the first 10 or 16 chapters is just a cycle of Israel failing 7 times over. And, like, it ends with Moses stressing out himself and failing himself. And they fail, God either judges them or gives them mercy. And once they actually see the land of Canaan for themselves and everything that they were promised, they're like, oh man, we're not going to be able to defeat them. We're gonna die if we try to fight the giants of the land. And God is like, I am so fed up with you guys. For every day that you were looking over in the land of Canaan, I'm going to turn it into years that you're going to stay in the desert. And everybody older than 20 is going to die here. Which, yeah, after so much complaining, it makes sense. They need that object lesson. And of course, they're really whining about it and try to take the land for themselves because they don't want to stay another 40 years in the desert. And they lose the battle against Canaanite city. I forget the name. I think it was... No, I forget. It's like number 16 or something. And, of course, Korah rebels, and Moses questions his authority when he does that, and Aaron's authority. So the next day there's a competition. God saves Moses while he burns Korah and his men in fire and puts the rest in some kind of earthquake, like a pit of the earth, as if the earth swallowed them up. And because they wanted to kill Moses and go back to Egypt, maybe conquer Egypt, not become slaves. They thought they had that kind of power over God. It's just crazy. So yeah, the book ends with a new generation of people. Um, one of them are daughters who didn't have a father, and instead of complaining about how the system is, sorry, daughters who didn't have a brother. They didn't want the inheritance of their dead father to go to their surrounding family. So they worked within the law and said, hey, we would like to have the inheritance for ourselves because we think we can do a good job with it. And Moses said, okay, here you go. Yeah, patriarchal system, I know. It was just, it wasn't even the norm in the ancient world. It was just reality. Like, they didn't debate patriarchy because, like, women died from childbirth. Women were weaker than men. Women were usually more emotional. They couldn't be useful in war. So I just like everybody was probably a misogynist. Well, no, not a misogynist, just like a sexist. Because I mean, like not everybody hated women, but everybody pretty much agreed women were inferior for all the reasons listed, which is obviously not true. But if you're living in that culture and that's all you know, how are you not going to believe it? So, why Genesis as book number 4? Because Genesis was probably told in bits and pieces to Israel. Like, remember, most of Genesis is talking about the family of Abraham. So the focus is on the people of Abraham, aka the people of the faith of Yahweh. So, also, a lot of the book makes no sense without context from earlier books. Context about um, whether you should be married by a kinsman, which is what the story of Lot and the story of Judah are about, marriage and intercourse to a kinsman. Also, characters like Amalek are mentioned. Characters like Midian are mentioned. Characters like Edom are mentioned. And this book makes a lot more sense in retrospect to all of that. The Amorites, the Rephaim are mentioned. And a world devoid of desire for God is shown. And God is persevering with Noah and Abraham's family despite all of that, which is really cool. I'd say don't read it as a science textbook, though, because that's not what the authors intended. The authors intended a theological message, and that should honestly be respected. It's a theological, historical message that's being spoken of, not a scientific one. Nobody was around to witness Genesis 1:1, yet we try to force it into very scientific terms, which is not the intention. The intention is, what is life without God? What was life without God? Because we can go back to that. We can go back to a place outside of sacred space, outside of the 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 temple building, or outside of the temple of Israel. We can go back to that very easily. A lot of people are in that, even. Oh yeah, and speaking of outside, uh, Deuteronomy 32 worldview pretty much outlines that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were definitely angelic beings. and part of the flood narrative was to wipe them out. Why are they still around after that in the Rephaim in the book of Numbers? Probably because it was a local flood. Not something I want to get into right now, but that is something I can argue pretty hard, especially since we have evidence of a regional flood, not so much evidence for a global flood. How were their gods ruling in Egypt? Like, maybe literal gods, maybe like, just metaphorically they were gods, whatever. Because God gave them charge over the nations, and they failed. Now, Christians usually see Genesis 3 as the reason the world is sideways. But the traditional view is Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11. Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve sinned. Genesis 6, where man decided to mingle with the sons of God. And Genesis 11, where the nations decided to try to build monuments for praise of their name, like the Tower of Babel. It probably wasn't just Babel, it's probably other nations. And what's great is all of Genesis 1 through 11, there's parallels to that text in a lot of world religions, mainly the Babylonian religions. So a lot of the ancient Near East knew a lot of that text, but only like they knew there was a flood. They knew there were gods touching the earth in the days of old. They knew that cities were dissipated by some god coming down. But only Genesis could say why those things happened, or what those things mean. So I think that's really cool. Like, this is literally for an Israelite who's with their Babylonian neighbor, and they need to discuss the meaning of events with their Babylonian neighbor. Genesis 1 through 11 is there for that. And the rest of the story is Abraham, of course, and his family. And how God is looking to make sacred space with them. Probably taught after Israel experienced Exodus. I doubt most of Israel knew these stories. There's no way, with all the generations between Adam and Israel and Egypt, that they all cared to tell the actual history of events the precise way. So lastly, the book of Leviticus is cool. A book about what is holiness, because it talks about like sexual sin. It goes into depth about stuff like sexual sin and treating your neighbors, like how to treat your neighbors, and sacrifices. And these are stuff we could apply today, maybe not in the same literal way as we used to. Well, definitely not the sacrifices. But metaphorically, we can sacrifice our time to God, and in the same ways, in fellowship, through our leaders. Even eating too. You can consider eating as a sacrifice. In the old world, sometimes sacrifices to gods were not burnt up, they were just eaten. Like that happened in all cultures. And people wouldn't even think about it too much because that was just how you ate. And the same thing we can apply to Leviticus. When we offer our time, when we offer anything we have to God, we can do it to the glory of God. Now, if you're thinking, oh, the old covenant is old, we should just stick to the new covenant, you need to realize not only did Jesus practice all 5 books as they were taught. Not only did he memorize them, and not only did he say, not a dot or tittle will pass from the law until all things pass away, but Paul, in the book of Acts, reaffirms that most of the law, even outside the 10 Commandments, should be kept even for Gentiles. And that is, there 4 things mainly. Not everything, but a lot of it. 4 specific things. The first one is, to keep the law, is blood. Do not drink blood. Blood belongs to God. That's in the law. Keep that, especially if you're a Gentile. The second thing is strangling. Do not strangle animals that you eat. The third thing is sexual immorality. Don't do sexual immorality. Even if the law is passed, don't fornicate, don't sodomize, don't pretend to be some other gender. That's in the law. We as Gentiles should take that on. And the fourth thing is things offered to idols, which may be obvious, but I mean, some people pray to a God that isn't monotheistic, to some other God entirely, one who does like being created in some image or portrait and worshipped. Like if you go to a Hindu restaurant and they pray over the food they cook, probably shouldn't eat it. It's offered to idols. You don't want to bind yourself to that idol somehow. Acts chapter 15, by the way, he says that. So yeah, Gentiles should keep portions of the Torah beyond the first 10 commandments. And I mean, should they also keep the rest of the Torah? Only if they want to. Only if they want to. That's a question I did sincerely struggle with for a bit, but now that we have Jesus, those things kind of pass away. But if you're like a Jewish Christian, then you should still, I'd say you should still be keeping those laws, because that's God's covenant with Abraham, and I don't think it's been fulfilled yet. So just to show that, hey, I'm waiting on the promise of Israel returning, I'd say, yeah, definitely keep the rest of it. Like, keep kosher laws. Why not? But realize that, like, don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, or don't eat pork. Laws like that are meant to distinguish yourself from your Canaanite and Philistine neighbors, because they were very idolatrous. And they, like, the first one is about a rite of passage. The second one is about economic and cultural control. Like, that's what those laws were about. They weren't about being closer to nature, like Aleph Beta tried to argue. I forget the rabbi's name. I feel kind of bad. But they tried to argue like, oh, not eating cheese and meat at the same time, that's about being closer to nature. Like, no. It's because that's what the Canaanites did as a rite of passage. They tortured animals. We're not Canaanites. We don't have to be like Canaanites. We can be like Israelites. Something else I didn't mention, the 10 plagues in Exodus, that wasn't just an attack on the Egyptian economy. It was also an attack against Egyptian gods, because they said to have powers similar to those plagues. And they actually tried replicating the destruction of the first 3 plagues, but eventually they couldn't, like the sorcerers. So that polemic against those plagues is very important, to say, like, your gods aren't real. This God is. Yahweh is real. Now, it's very possible that, like, God, of course God did that so Egypt would remember him. And my thinking is that because Ramses was probably the pharaoh of the Exodus, that he interpreted Yahweh as Atum, the god of creation, I think. I don't know if he made a statue out of Adam, but it seems that Ramses, in honor of the god Yahweh, when Ramses stopped going to war, he built temples for Adam, because he thought Yahweh was Adam. Which, I mean, if they're both like ancient creator gods, which are passed down by word of mouth, their stories, then it's a pretty good possibility. I mean, it's a pretty good insinuation to make. The only problem would be to make a statue out of them, because God doesn't need statues. God just wants to talk. That's all. Israel did the same thing, though, and they got punished for it. The golden calf, a statue of Yahweh, because Yahweh is called the Bull of Judah. So they thought, okay, Moses is gone. Here's a way we can communicate with Yahweh on our terms. They make a statue out of him, and they get killed for it. Something else I did not mention. Like, these stories aren't just meant to point to the Messiah. These stories are to communicate God's character with his people. So, like, they're more than just, like, Jesus doesn't reference this stuff because it was only meant for pointing to the Messiah. That's so, like, that's really bad hindsight reading. He referenced this stuff to kind of reframe the stories, kind of use the stories that the Jews knew in their cultural context, and kind of bend their vision onto him. Like, he used their language of the stories they knew to point to him. So stories like the bronze snake. The bronze snake is a great parallel to Christ. But the bronze snake wasn't built to point you to Christ. It was built to point the Israelites to God. Why a bronze snake? Because they believed in magic. They didn't know the difference between magic and just being a regular doctor. So they believed in like a type of sympathetic magic, healing magic. And they got that from Egypt, because Egypt had necklaces with snakes that were supposed to be magical and were supposed to keep them safe from danger. So God says, okay, build this snake so they can believe in me. The snake's not going to have power, but their belief will, because I'm powerful. So, they sin, they get bitten by snakes as punishment, and God tests them out by saying, okay, this is going to point to me. Build this, and tell them, if you believe, you will be healed. So that was a test of their faith. Would they believe that God was a merciful God, or would they die in their hatred? And I'm sure some people just died in their hatred because of how stubborn they were. But others believed. Many believed. And that's been a part of the tension of the entire 5 books. That some people, like, they're willing to believe God is powerful, but they're not willing to believe that he cares, or he's loving, or that he can do everything they have need for. And God, time and time again, has to show them, yes, I'm here for you. I want to meet with you. Like, the temple, that's us meeting. Through the priest, that's us meeting. Cleansing you of your sins, that's what I want for you. And like, yeah, hey, we have Jesus now, and Jesus is way better than how they used to have it. Like, not every offering could, I don't think every offering could cover for every sin, because some sins were pretty preventable, I guess. But there was still forgiveness there. There was still mercy entwined in how we advocated for justice. And I think we ought to take that message in our reading of the text, because it is foundational reading for the entire book of the Bible. So I can recommend some sources. Good luck in your